In February 1945, in the shattered streets of Cologne, Germany, one of the most stunning reversals in armored warfare took place when a German Panther tank crew confidently prowled past the medieval cathedral, hunting for what they believed would be easy prey. For years, they had mocked American armor as rolling coffins, dismissing every Sherman they encountered as target practice. They had heard the rumors about a new American heavy tank, but they laughed them off. After all, the Americans had never produced anything that could stand toe-to-toe with German steel. That arrogance would cost them everything in the next 60 seconds. The story begins not in Cologne, but in the deserts of North Africa in 1942, where American tank crews first encountered the reality of German armor superiority. The M4 Sherman, America's frontline medium tank, rolled into battle with confidence born from industrial might and democratic optimism. It was reliable, mass-produced, and crewed by brave men who believed in their mission. But when the first Shermans met German Panzer IVs and Tigers, that confidence evaporated in flashes of armor-piercing fire. The Sherman's 75mm gun bounced rounds off German frontal armor like pebbles off castle walls. German crews began calling American tanks Tommy Cookers and Ronsons after the cigarette lighter because they lit up on the first strike. By 1944, as Allied forces pushed into France after D-Day, the imbalance had grown obscene. German tank crews piloting Tigers and Panthers didn't just defeat American armor, they humiliated it. A single Tiger I, with its 88mm gun and thick frontal armor, could destroy an entire column of Shermans before they could even get into effective firing range. The Sherman's gun could penetrate a Tiger's armor only at point-blank range, from the side or rear, and even then it required luck. German crews knew this. They felt invincible. They joked among themselves that fighting American tanks was like shooting practice with moving targets. The Americans brought numbers, yes, but numbers meant nothing when your weapon couldn't pierce the enemy's skin. The psychological impact on American tank crews was devastating. They climbed into their Shermans knowing they were outgunned, outmatched, and likely to die if they encountered a Tiger or Panther. Crews began painting extra sandbags and scrap metal onto their hulls, desperate makeshift armor that added weight, but little protection. Tankers developed a grim fatalism. They called their Shermans death traps. Survival became a matter of luck, terrain advantage, and prayer. The U.S. Army's doctrine compensated with numerical superiority and air support, but that was cold comfort to the men inside those thin-skinned machines. Meanwhile, German crews grew more arrogant with every kill. They believed they were the masters of armored combat, inheritors of a warrior tradition that stretched back to the Teutonic Knights. American tankers were just factory workers playing soldier. But in the industrial cities of the United States, something was changing. Engineers and military planners had recognized the problem as early as 1942. The Sherman was never meant to fight heavy tanks. It was designed to exploit breakthroughs, support infantry, and engage medium armor. But the war had evolved. The Germans kept producing heavier, deadlier machines. America needed a response. Development began on a heavy tank that could match the Tiger and Panther on equal terms. The project moved slowly, hampered by bureaucracy, doctrinal resistance, and the Army's commitment to the Sherman as its primary platform. Generals argued that heavy tanks were unnecessary, that air power and superior numbers would win the war. But the men dying and burning Shermans knew better. The result was the T-26 project, later designated the M26 Pershing. It mounted a 90mm gun capable of penetrating Tiger and Panther armor at combat ranges. Its frontal armor was significantly thicker than the Sherman's, sloped at angles that deflected incoming rounds. It weighed 46 tons, making it a true heavy tank by American standards, though only a medium by German classification. But development dragged on. Prototypes were tested, modified, tested again. The Ordnance Department worried about reliability. The Army ground forces worried about strategic mobility. Meanwhile, in Europe, Shermans continued to burn. By late 1944, the urgency became undeniable. The Battle of the Bulge in December shocked American command. German panzers spearheaded the offensive with terrifying effectiveness, tearing through American lines and proving once again that armor superiority mattered. The Pershing was finally rushed into production. The first 20 machines were shipped to Europe in January 1945, assigned to the 3rd and 9th Armored Divisions. German intelligence learned of the new tank's existence, but their crews dismissed it. Another American attempt to copy German designs, they thought. It would be heavier, maybe, but still inferior. The Americans simply didn't understand armored warfare the way the Germans did. The first Pershings arrived in Belgium and were immediately sent to the front. American crews, pulled from Sherman units, climbed into these new machines with cautious hope. The Pershing was bigger, roomier, more heavily armed. Its gun felt powerful. Its armor felt reassuring. But they had been disappointed before. The upgraded Sherman Firefly had promised better firepower, and it helped. But it was still a Sherman underneath. Would the Pershing be different? Or would it just be a bigger coffin? They would find out soon enough. In early February 1945, Pershings from the 3rd Armored Division moved into Germany as part of the Allied push toward the Rhine. German forces were retreating, but they weren't broken. Panther and Tiger tanks formed the backbone of delaying actions, exacting bloody tolls on advancing American columns. German crews remained confident. Yes, the war was lost strategically. Yes, the Allies had overwhelming numbers and air superiority. But in direct combat, tank to tank, the Germans still ruled. They had fought the Soviets' heavy IS-2 tanks and the British Churchills. They respected those machines, but they had learned to defeat them. Whatever the Americans brought would be no different. The first confirmed engagement between a Pershing and German armor occurred near the town of Elsdorf on February 27, 1945. An M26 from the 3rd Armored Division encountered a Panzer IV, one of Germany's older but still capable medium tanks. The German crew spotted the Pershing and initially hesitated. It was larger than a Sherman, unfamiliar, but the Panzer IV's commander had faced dozens of American tanks. He ordered his gunner to engage. The German round struck the Pershing's frontal armor and ricocheted off harmlessly. The American crew barely felt the impact. The Pershing's gunner, a young corporal from Michigan, centered his sights and fired. The 90mm armor-piercing round penetrated the Panzer IV's hull and detonated the ammunition. The German tank exploded. The kill took 8 seconds from first contact. The Pershing's crew sat in stunned silence, then erupted in cheers. For the first time, they had traded fire with a German tank and won decisively. Word spread quickly through both armies. American tankers began requesting transfers to Pershing units. Morale surged. Finally, they had a weapon that could fight back. But the Germans dismissed the encounter. A Panzer IV was not a Tiger. It was not a Panther. The real test would come when American heavy tanks met German heavy tanks. That test was coming. On March 6, 1945, the city of Cologne stood as one of the last major German urban centers on the western side of the Rhine. American forces were advancing through the rubble-choked streets, facing determined resistance from Wehrmacht and SS units. German armor prowled the ruins, using the shattered buildings as cover for ambushes. Among them was a Panther OSV, crewed by veterans of the Eastern Front. These men had fought at Kursk and survived the Soviet onslaught. They had destroyed T-34s by the dozen. They were survivors, professionals, believers in German technical superiority. When they heard that an American heavy tank was operating in their sector, they actively hunted for it. They wanted the kill. They wanted to prove that German engineering remained supreme. The American Pershing, nicknamed Eagle 7 by its crew, moved cautiously through Cologne streets. The crew was tense. Urban combat was a nightmare for tanks, with ambushes possible from every corner. But they had a mission to support infantry pushing toward the cathedral. The crew commander, a lieutenant from Pennsylvania, scanned the ruins through his periscope. Behind him, the gunner and loader waited. The driver navigated carefully around craters and debris. They had heard the stories about the Panther. They knew its reputation, but they also knew they were in the best tank America had ever built. The two machines met on a street near the cathedral, filmed by an American combat cameraman who had taken position in a building overlooking the intersection. The footage would become iconic. The Panther rounded a corner, its long 75mm gun traversing, searching. The German crew spotted the Pershing simultaneously. Both tanks stopped. For a fraction of a second, neither fired, locked in mutual recognition. Then both guns roared. The Panther fired first. The German gunner, confident in his weapon and his skill, aimed for the Pershing's frontal hull. The armor-piercing round struck the American tank's glacis plate with a metallic shriek and deflected upward, failing to penetrate. The Pershing's sloped armor, combined with its thickness, had done its job. Inside, the American crew felt the impact, but remained unharmed. The gunner, his hand steady despite the adrenaline, had already aimed. He fired. The 90mm round struck the Panther's frontal turret armor and punched through. The penetration was clean, catastrophic. The German crew had no time to react. The round detonated inside the turret, killing the gunner and commander instantly. Ammunition cooked off. Smoke and flame erupted from the Panther's hatches. The surviving crew members bailed out, stumbling through the smoke, their faces masks of shock and disbelief. The engagement had lasted less than 10 seconds. The Pershing sat motionless for a moment, its crew processing what had just happened. They had met a Panther, the tank that had haunted American armored forces for 2 years, and they had destroyed it in a frontal engagement. Not from the side, not from ambush, face to face. The psychological impact on both sides was seismic. For the Americans, it was vindication, proof that they finally had a weapon worthy of the fight. For the Germans who witnessed it or heard the reports, it was a shock that shattered assumptions. The Americans had always been inferior in armor. That was a known truth. Except now it wasn't. German tank crews in other sectors heard the news and refused to believe it. Propaganda, they said. A lucky shot. The Panther crew must have made an error. But then more reports came in. Another Pershing destroyed a Panther near Remagen. Another knocked out a Tiger II, the most heavily armored tank in the German arsenal, during fighting along the Rhine. The pattern was undeniable. The Americans had produced a tank that could kill German armor frontally, reliably, repeatedly. The mockery stopped. The jokes about Tommy Cookers and Ronsons disappeared. In their place came a grudging, uncomfortable respect, mixed with the bitter realization that Germany's technological edge had eroded. The psychological shift was profound. For years, German panzer crews had defined their identity through technical superiority. They were outnumbered, yes. They were losing the war, yes. But they were individually superior, masters of their craft, pilots of the finest armored vehicles ever built. That belief had sustained them through retreat after retreat. Now, in the war's final months, even that consolation was stripped away. American tankers, the ones they had dismissed as amateurs, could now fight them on equal terms and win. The humiliation was complete. The Pershing's impact extended beyond simple kill ratios. Its presence on the battlefield forced German commanders to reconsider tactics. Panther and Tiger crews could no longer charge American armor columns with confidence. They had to respect the Pershing's gun, avoid frontal engagements, seek ambush positions. The psychological advantage had reversed. American tank crews, equipped with Pershings, advanced with new aggression. They actively sought engagements with German armor. The hunters had become the hunted. Only 20 Pershings saw combat in World War II. 20 tanks. Out of the thousands of armored vehicles in the European theater, this tiny number disproportionately affected German morale and American confidence. The rarity of the Pershing encounters made them legendary. Stories spread through both armies. American tankers who never saw a Pershing in person spoke of it with reverence. German crews who survived encounters with the M26 spoke of it with fear. The myth grew larger than the reality, but the reality was substantial enough. The Pershing could, and did, defeat Germany's best armor in direct combat. The technical specifications told the story in cold numbers. The Sherman's 75mm gun could penetrate roughly 91mm of armor at 500 meters. The Panther's frontal armor was 80mm thick, but sloped at 55 degrees, giving it an effective thickness of about 140mm. The Sherman couldn't reliably penetrate it from the front. The Pershing's 90mm gun could penetrate 190mm of armor at 500 meters. It could punch through a Panther's frontal armor. It could damage a Tiger's frontal hull. It could penetrate a Tiger II's turret face. For the first time, American tankers had a weapon that made German armor vulnerable from the front. But numbers don't capture the emotional dimension. The Sherman crews who died in burning tanks, who watched their friends incinerate because their weapons were inadequate, never lived to see the Pershing vindicate their sacrifice. The German crews who survived the war, who had mocked American armor and believed in their own invincibility, carried the memory of that shock, that moment when their certainty shattered. The Pershing represented more than firepower. It represented the collapse of an illusion, the end of psychological dominance that had defined armored combat on the Western Front. After the Cologne engagement, German intelligence desperately tried to gather information on the Pershing. They wanted to know its weaknesses, its vulnerabilities. Captured documents and crew interrogations revealed some details, but by March 1945, Germany lacked the industrial capacity to respond. Even if they could have designed a counter, there was no time, no resources, no factories left untouched by Allied bombing. The Pershing had arrived too late to change the war's outcome, but just in time to humiliate the Panzer Arm in its final months. That timing made the psychological impact even sharper. The Germans had believed they would lose the war, but win the technical battle. The Pershing proved them wrong on both counts. American crews who transitioned from Shermans to Pershings described the difference in almost spiritual terms. One sergeant from the 3rd Armored Division said climbing into a Pershing felt like finally being allowed to fight, after spending months as a target. Another tanker described the relief of knowing that if he encountered a Tiger, he had a chance. Not a guarantee, but a chance. That was revolutionary. The armor was thicker. The gun was powerful. The visibility was better. The interior was more spacious, less cramped. Everything about the Pershing communicated that America had finally taken the tank seriously, had finally committed to protecting its crews and giving them competitive tools. The German perspective was darker. A Panther commander captured after the Rhine crossings admitted in interrogation that the appearance of the Pershing had broken something in German armored units. Not their will to fight, but their sense of inevitability. They had believed that even in defeat, they would maintain technical superiority, that history would remember German tanks as the finest ever built. The Pershing, crude and rushed as it was by German standards, destroyed that narrative. It was competitive. It was effective. It was good enough. And good enough, combined with American industrial capacity, meant Germany had lost even the psychological consolation of technical mastery. The Pershing's combat record was impressive given its limited deployment. Of the 20 tanks that saw action, none were lost to German tank fire. Several were damaged by anti-tank guns, mines, and mechanical failures, but not a single Pershing was destroyed in a tank-versus-tank engagement. The survival rate stood in stark contrast to the Sherman's brutal losses. The Pershing proved the concept. Properly armed and armored heavy tanks could dominate the battlefield and protect their crews. The lesson was clear, though it came too late for the thousands of American tankers who died in inadequate machines. German post-war analysis of the Pershing was grudging but honest. Former Panzer officers acknowledged that the M26 was a competent design, comparable to the Panther in capability and superior to the Panzer IV. Some argued that it was overweight and underpowered for its size, criticisms that had merit, but these were technical quibbles. The fundamental reality was undeniable. The Pershing could kill German heavy tanks from the front, and German crews had mocked the possibility of that ever happening. Their arrogance had been proven catastrophically wrong. The transformation was complete by April 1945. German tank crews who encountered Pershings no longer engaged unless they had overwhelming tactical advantage. They avoided frontal duels. They withdrew when possible. The aggressive confidence that had characterized German armored operations for years evaporated. American tankers noticed a change. Enemy tanks that previously would have pressed attacks now retreated. The psychological balance had shifted. The Pershing hadn't arrived in sufficient numbers to alter the war's strategic trajectory, but it had altered the emotional landscape of armored warfare. The Americans were no longer victims. The Germans were no longer invincible. By the war's end in May 1945, the Pershing's legend far exceeded its actual battlefield presence. Stories of the Cologne duel circulated widely. The combat footage became required viewing for American tank crews. The tank represented redemption, proof that American engineering could compete with and defeat German armor. For the tankers who had survived months in Shermans, the Pershing was a symbol of vindication, a machine that validated their complaints and honored their fallen friends. For German veterans, it was a bitter reminder that their technical superiority had been temporary, illusory, and ultimately irrelevant. The post-war years saw the Pershing evaluated and improved, eventually evolving into the M26 Patton series. But the World War II Pershings, those 20 tanks that fought in Germany's final months, remained iconic. They represented the moment when American armored forces finally achieved parity with their opponents, when the psychological dominance of German armor finally broke. The men who crewed those tanks carried that pride for the rest of their lives. They had been given a weapon worthy of their courage. They had proven that American tankers were not inferior, only inadequately equipped, and they had forced the German crews who survived to acknowledge what they had spent years denying. The Americans could build a tank that matched the best Germany had to offer. The irony is almost poetic. German tank crews mocked American armor for 3 years, dismissing every Sherman as a mobile crematorium, every American tanker as a naive amateur. They built their identity on technical superiority, on the belief that German engineering and tactical skill made them unbeatable in individual combat. Then, in the war's last desperate months, when Germany was collapsing and defeat was certain, the Americans finally fielded a tank that could beat them. Not in the war's decisive battles, not when it might have shortened the conflict, but just in time to shatter the last illusion of German armored supremacy. The Pershing arrived like a final humiliation, a crushing reminder that even in their specialty, even in the domain they considered their own, the Germans were not invincible. They had mocked American armor. The M26 Pershing ended their reign and forced them to respect what they had dismissed. The story of the Pershing is a reminder that arrogance built on temporary advantages is fragile, that technological superiority is fleeting, and that the capacity to adapt and improve often matters more than initial dominance. The German tank crews who laughed at American armor in 1942 and 1943 watched their certainty crumble in 1945 when the machine they had considered impossible rolled into Cologne and destroyed a Panther in a frontal duel. The Americans they had mocked proved capable of learning, designing, and building a weapon that met the challenge. The transformation from dismissive superiority to shocked respect happened in seconds, captured on film, immortalized in the memories of those who witnessed it. What do you think of the M26 Pershing and its impact on the final months of World War II? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.